Rules Committee will come to order, and thank you very much for rejoining us for another fun day at the Rules Committee. Today, the committee will be considering H.R. 4324, the Strengthening and Oversight of Iran's Access to Financial Act, H.R. 1638, the Iranian Leadership Asset Transparency Act, H.R. 4015, the Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act of 2017, and H.R. 2396, the Privacy Notification Technical Clarification Act. See how close I get to it. H.R. 4342 requires the Secretary of Treasury to submit a report to Congress with respect to transactions authorized for financial institutions in connection with the export or re-export of aircraft to the country of Iran. The State Department has declared Iran the leading state sponsor of terrorism, and previous use of commercial passenger planes to transport rockets, missiles, and other military cargo remains troubling, not only to the United States of America, but to anybody in the free world. This legislation simply ensures Congress receives essential information from the Department of the Treasury regarding the risks involved with aircraft financing with Iran. The committee will also be considering H.R. 1638, the legislation that would require the Treasury Department to develop and post online a list estimating the funds and assets held by senior Iranian political and military leaders, along with a description of how they acquired the assets and how those assets are employed. The third bill under consideration today before the Rules Committee is the Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act of 2017. It enhances transparency in the shareholder proxy system by requiring proxy advisors firms to register with Securities and Exchange Commission to disclose potential conflicts of interest and codes of ethics, and makes publicly available their methodologies for formulating proxy recommendations and analysis. This legislation will, or is intended to foster greater accountability, transparency, responsiveness, and competition in the proxy advisory industry, and to help ensure that proxy advisory firms are looking out for the interests of long-term shareholders. The final bill under consideration before the Rules Committee today is H.R. 2396. It amends the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act to exempt from its annual privacy policy notice requirement certain financial institutions that comply with other certain expectations. A number of financial institutions are unable to meet the conditions included in the current annual notice delivery exemption. H.R. 2396 provides flexibility to address that issue for financial institutions to use alternative delivery message and would allow them to make privacy policies available to customers on the institution's website. So we'd like to welcome the panel that we have today. Without objection, I'd like to say that the distinguished gentleman, Andy Barr from Kentucky, will be with us, as well as the gentleman from Washington, Congressman Hecht, to be our first panel today. Without objection, anything you brought in writing will be entered the record, and I look forward to your testimony. However, before we get to you, we're going to defer to the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for any opening statement the gentleman would choose to make. Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our two witnesses, but in all candor, I think given the fact that we're here this week and next week, and that's it, that there are more pressing needs that we ought to be concerned with. CHIP and community health centers funding expired in September, and we have yet to reach bipartisan agreement. And health care for millions of children and families hangs in the balance. Congress has to pass disaster relief funding to help Americans that are still recovering from the most devastating hurricane and wildfire seasons in recent memory. Communities desperately need resources to fight the opiate epidemic, which is killing 91 Americans every day and in every corner of the country. The Department of Veterans Affairs is facing a dire shortfall, and we need to come together to ensure that no veteran is left behind or denied the care and opportunities they deserve. Millions of hardworking Americans' pensions are at risk, and it is time that we enact a responsible reform plan that ensures that these struggling pension plans can be sustained. We need to pass the DREAM Act. We've been raising this issue time and time again. 800,000 lives are literally in the balance. We need to raise the budget caps in order to provide agencies with the funding we need to keep our government running. And lastly, we need to do our job and pass a bill to fully fund the government. We cannot responsibly pass another short-term funding measure or worse, risk a government shutdown. And each week that the government shuts down, as the Chairman knows, costs the economy about $6.5 billion. So, again, I'm happy to be with all my colleagues here, but when I think of kind of Tier 1 legislation that is urgent, that needs to be done immediately, with respect, the stuff we're considering today doesn't fall into that category. And again, we're running out of time, and I hope it, you know, unless there's a massive plan to, you know, do 24-hour sessions to kind of keep us going to get this other stuff done, I'm worried we're going to recess for the year, and a lot of stuff is going to fall through the cracks. So I thank the Chairman for the time, and I yield back.
Mr. McGovern, thank you very much. I think the gentleman really accurately paints a picture of the work that is left for us. And what I would say to the gentleman is, he's exactly right to make sure that we're going to keep our eye on that ball. With that said, would the gentleman from Texas offer any feedback from his viewpoint as chairman of the subcommittee in Energy and Commerce related to CHIP as it relates to, we have previously heard several times that the gentleman, Mr. Pallone, who is the ranking member of the committee, has not been in favor of us moving forward the CHIP reauthorization. Do you have any feedback or any information that might enable this committee to respond a little bit better to the gentleman off his questions that he raises? Gentleman will be recognized.
Well, thank the chairman for the recognition, and the chairman knows that the Committee on Energy and Commerce at the subcommittee level and the full committee level passed through regular order CHIP and Community Health Center funding bills, funding for some residency programs that are covered under that legislation. The bill was offset, and the bill came to the floor. We passed the bill out of committee the early part of October. It came to the floor in early November and passed the floor of the House. It was not completely on a party line vote. I think there were 3 Republicans who voted no, and there were 14 Democrats who voted yes. So the opposition was divided. But nevertheless, it has awaited activity over in the Senate, and for whatever reason, they have not seen it to be useful to proceed with that legislation. I wish they would. There are states that are up against a hard stop as far as their dollars are concerned. I think the state of Minnesota comes to mind, the state of Colorado, the state of California, the state of Massachusetts may be up against that. Texas has a larger cushion, but at the same time, additional stress placed on the system by the hurricanes and the flooding that occurred right after Labor Day. So it's an important bill. We have done our work on the House side. The bill is everything that the Senate Finance Committee said they wanted was provided to them. I personally felt we ought to do a 2-year bill. Committee Democrats wanted a 5-year bill. Senate Finance Committee wanted a 5-year bill. They got a 5-year bill. The bill was responsibly offset. In addition to the funding for community health centers and the Children's Health Insurance Program, there was also some additional help to normalize the Medicaid and Medicare programs in Puerto Rico, not part of disaster assistance, but problems that were brought to Chairman Walden's and my attention during the course of the year, and we made a good faith effort to fix that problem and did do so in this bill. And there is also some help for states that were losing their disproportionate share funds under the Affordable Care Act. That, of course, kicked in October 1st. and that was delayed by 2 years with the, or would be delayed by 2 years with the passage of this bill. Important to our state, Chairman, but important to a great many other states as well. So the bill is there. I frankly do not understand why the Senate has not passed it. I'm hopeful that our leadership will bring it as part of whatever continuing resolution comes forward to us in the next 10 days, because the work has been done, the offsets have been agreed to, and there's just no reason not to bring it forward. I thank the chairman for the opportunity to explain that.
Mr.
Thank you
Chairman?
very much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so with respect, we heard the same excuse last week from the gentleman from Texas, and I will just repeat, if the leadership of this House is interested in a bipartisan agreement, then they ought to take seriously our concerns about the offsets. Cutting the prevention fund, cutting things that help with initiatives like immunizations, for example, is not something that we find acceptable. And so if we're trying to, come to a bipartisan consensus here, it's not my way or the highway. There has to be some give and take. And I think, if we could, commit ourselves to trying to resolve some of those differences, maybe we can get something done. But again, I appreciate the gentleman from Texas giving me his statement. I think it's the exact statement we got last week when we raised this issue, and it doesn't give me great encouragement that there's a spirit of bipartisanship here, nor does it give me any encouragement that this is a priority for this leadership. So I hope that changes. And again, I raise all these issues because to me, given the fact that we're here this week and next week, and that's it, there seems an awful lot to do. And again, I appreciate the work that has gone into what we're doing here today, but I don't think that what we're doing here today rises to the level of the issues that I raised. So I thank the gentleman. I yield.
Further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I would just
Yes, sir.
simply point
Gentleman's
out
recognized.
that the prevention fund, only a portion of the dollars come from the prevention fund. Prevention is part of the Children's Health Insurance Program, as is the vaccine program. And quite frankly, the prevention fund has been used in other vehicles in the past over the last 7 years, and some of which I believe the gentleman from Massachusetts has voted in favor of. So that was not an unusual or exotic offset provided in the bill, and it is not the only offset in the bill. There are other places where the revenue is generated to offset the $18 billion cost of the 5-year CHIP bill. Now yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Just one final point. I remind the gentleman that his party controls the House and the Senate and the presidency. And if you can't get it done, you're going to have to work in a bipartisan way. And I would suggest that maybe we drop the my way or the highway approach and begin to have discussions, serious discussions with the Democrats about coming to some accommodation. None of us are expecting to get 100% of what we want, but there are some serious problems with the approach that you have had. But again, you control everything. You can't get it done, so you're going to need our help. And I'm just giving you some advice on how you might be able to get that help. But with that, I yield back.
Chairman yields back his time. I want to thank the gentleman for his help and assistance, and I will tell you, as a member of the Republican leadership team, it in fact is a priority for us. We have several big priorities that are outlined each week, not only on the floor, but one of them is getting CHIP done. I've spoken going back to several months ago when the gentlewoman brought it up with me. I made sure that the gentleman, Chairman Walden and Chairman Burgess, spoke very clearly. Their enunciation has been regular, and the presence of them in speaking with states and identifying the issues of states, including the last CR where there were provisions that were made pending the final answer. And I will tell you that CHIP is a very important high priority for our Republican leadership. And the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, is foremost in front of that issue. And I want to thank the gentleman for his not only leadership in this issue, but also keeping me up to date, because, Mike, I appreciate your insistence. Does the gentleman from Georgia wish to speak up further about this? The gentleman would not ask to add the gentlewoman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given that we had 60-some votes to kill health care, there's not enough evidence to convict that you all really want to do some health care for these children. And in addition to CHIP, which is critically important, are the community health centers.
Yes, ma'am.
And all the people that they serve in the United States. It's really astonishing to me that we would even consider doing anything with this tax bill and not get those things funded.
Well, you know, a lot of this.
We're besieged by people, I mean, and frankly, I took your word and I'm sure you gave it in good faith.
saw evidence.
And said to many people in the district that I was assured that both of those would be funded before the first of the year.
Yes, ma'am, and I believe they will be.
You believe in the Tooth Fairy?
I believe that we're going to get it done, and I believe that this should be done. It'd be easy for me to throw out excuses, but one of them is, I will guarantee you that we have few people that have been, one of them, a gentleman that worked for me for a number of years, was appointed months ago to be the head of HHS Legislative Affairs. It has taken literally 7 months to get him through the United States Senate because of the blockage that are occurring over there. And Republicans might be in charge, but they're faced with rules and regulations that are being stuck to. So the ability that we have to get a team in place all across the board, I believe has contributed to a slower amount of action, at least.
Now,
I
you may
can
not
speak.
be aware that Senator Grassley has just called the White House to withdraw a couple of their recommendations for federal judges because they were totally unqualified.
Well, that might be federal
So-
judges, but I'm talking
Well,
about HHS.
I think it's the same kind of thing.
It might
and,
be. Well, I think
But
Mr.
what is probably stopping them is not just aggravation, but probably laws.
Well, let me just say something.
We didn't have any trouble, did we? when we,
This gentleman that used to work for me, you would know, may perhaps remember, he was
Yeah.
a fine young man and comes as a result of expertise out of being in Kentucky as the commissioner of health in Kentucky, came with great credentials also.
Mm-hmm.
So he may, I think it's politics. Less whether he.
On your side?
No,
Well, you've
ma'am.
got the majority of it. It has to be. It's a silly
Well,
question.
there you go.
Okay.
Anyway, there's.
But Kentucky's okay, isn't it?
Kentucky.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr.
Any
Chairman.
further discussion we want to have? Seeing none, we'll now move forward. Thank you very much. Mr. Barr, Mr. Heck, welcome to the Rules Committee. We're delighted that you're here, and we want you to know that you are here, both of you, to represent not only your party and the district that you come from, but the best ideas that come forth about how we might accurately move these pieces of legislation. We're delighted that you're here. I would remind the gentleman, please pull that microphone up to you with a green light on it. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member Slaughter, and members of the Rules Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on 4 bipartisan bills that were favorably reported by the Financial Services Committee. Let me briefly discuss each of these 4 bills. H.R. 2396, the Privacy Notification Technical Clarification Act, was introduced by our colleague, Mr. Trott. It was approved by the Financial Services Committee 40-20, and it builds on an issue that has a long track record of strong bipartisan support in the Congress. This bill is a simple technical fix to clarify that consumers have to be physically mailed annual privacy notices when privacy policies have changed from the previous year. This bill was carefully crafted to maintain and retain current privacy policies. In fact, the legislation does not change privacy provisions at all, just how they are delivered. In doing so, this bill provides a simple and flexible approach that modernizes the privacy notification process for a larger number of financial services providers and their consumers. There is a serious issue here in that many consumers are drinking from a fire hose when it comes to disclosure. We know that if you disclose everything, you effectively disclose nothing. So we must ensure our constituents receive effective disclosure of material items, not constant, voluminous, fine print disclosures of irrelevant items written in legalese. This bipartisan legislation clarifies that annual privacy notices will be physically mailed to consumers only if an institution has changed its privacy policies or procedures. The bill also requires that privacy policy notices be readily available online. This legislation does not exempt any financial services provider from an initial privacy notice, nor does it allow a loophole for an institution to avoid issuing an updated notice. Another bill on the agenda today is H.R. 4015, the Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act, which was introduced by Mr. Duffy. H.R. 4015 would enhance transparency in the shareholder proxy system by requiring proxy advisory firms to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission, disclose potential conflicts of interest and codes of ethics, and make publicly available their methodologies. To say that proxy firms play a significant role in the U.S. economy and in shaping corporate governance would be an understatement. These firms counsel pension plans, mutual funds, and other institutional investors about how to vote the shares of corporations that they own. With respect to institutional investors, the share of institutional investor ownership was roughly 46% in 1987. Today, that figure is more than 75%. In other words, the volume of proxy votes for which investors are responsible has grown into the billions. However, regulators, market participants, and academic observers have highlighted potential conflicts of interest that are inherent in the business models and activities of proxy advisory firms. For example, in addition to providing recommendations about how to vote, proxy firms may advise companies about corporate governance issues, rate companies on corporate governance, and advise proponents about how to frame proposals to get the most votes. Mr. Duffy's bill helps address these concerns by setting up a new regulatory regime for proxy advisory firms that looks out for the interests of long-term shareholders by ensuring shareholders receive complete information throughout the proxy process and can better vote in a manner consistent with shareholder interest, as opposed to the potential shadow interests of the proxy firm. The Financial Services Committee also recently approved H.R. 4324, the Strengthening Oversight of Iran's Access to Finance Act, and I'm pleased it is on the Rules Committee agenda today. This bill was introduced by Mr. Williams of Texas. Under the nuclear agreement that former President Obama concluded with Iran 2 years ago, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, the previous administration committed to authorizing the export of civilian passenger aircraft to Iran. The State Department classifies Iran as the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, and the Treasury Department has designated it a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern. In 2016, Treasury licensed more than 200 planes for Iran Air, Iran's leading state-owned carrier, and included authorizations for U.S. banks to finance those sales. As recently as 2011, however, Iran Air has been sanctioned by Treasury for using its commercial passenger planes to transport military cargo on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and for transporting weapons to the brutal terrorist-sponsoring Assad regime of Syria. All that H.R. 4324 does is require a simple report to Congress describing connections, if any, between aircraft finance and Iran's harmful activities. The bill, importantly, does not reimpose sanctions lifted by the JCPOA. Some in this room, some in Congress would probably want to reimpose sanctions, but it's important to underscore what this bill does and what it does not do. And it doesn't apply new standards for licensing aircraft finance. It simply calls for information sharing between the administration and Congress. Wherever you are on the issue of the JCPOA, its wisdom, its outcomes, this bill does not undermine the JCPOA. It is a bill about better information exchange between the executive branch and the Congress. Lastly, I'm pleased to discuss H.R. 1638, the Iranian Leadership Asset Transparency Act, sponsored by Mr. Poliquin and passed by the Financial Services Committee on a bipartisan vote of 43-16. In fact, this bill is nearly identical to legislation the House passed in September 2016 by a vote of 282 to 143. Excuse me. This bill requires the Department of Treasury to report to Congress over the next 2 years on wealth accumulated by certain senior Iranian political and military leaders, how that wealth was likely obtained, and what is likely to be used for. Furthermore, the bill requires the Treasury Department to report on ways non-nuclear sanctions on Iran are being enforced and how their enforcement could be improved. Again, a bill that does not speak to the JCPOA and the nuclear sanctions lifted under that agreement, but instead non-nuclear sanctions and activities that the regime and the leadership are engaged in. The report would be posted on Treasury's website in English and in the 3 major languages spoken within Iran. Iran's top political, military, and business leaders fund much of the country's terrorist-related activity through intricate financial arrangements. To the extent Iran's leaders are able to use corrupt business practices in an economy that is already tightly controlled, they have more money to fund terrorist activities and to deny opportunity and eventual access to political power to the average Iranian citizens. To the extent of this corruption and this concentration of wealth among their leaders ought to be made clear to the people of Iran, Mr. Poliquin's bill will do just that. I thank you for the opportunity to discuss these 4 bills with you, and I welcome your questions.
Mr. Barr, thank you very much. We're delighted that you're here. The gentleman was very clear, and I appreciate it. Mr. Heck, welcome back. You found yourself not only at the Rules Committee on a regular basis, but I really, and I believe Louise, finds your testimony always most informative, and we're delighted to hear your ideas today. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, sir. I hope you.
Is that button pushed?
It is now. I hope you conclude similarly at the conclusion of my remarks today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Slaughter. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today and, in fact, to testify in opposition to all 4 of these bills. I'll begin with 4324, the so-called strengthening oversight of Iran's Access to Finance Act. One of the key U.S. obligations under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA as we refer to it, negotiated to address Iran's nuclear program, is to allow the export of aircraft and related parts and services to Iran when successfully negotiated. These exports are subject to appropriate conditions imposed through the export licenses to ensure that the aircraft are used for legitimate civil aviation purposes. If the aircraft are put to any other use, or if they are resold to sanctioned individuals, then the U.S. reserves the right to pull any licenses issued. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, has imposed rigorous conditions on any aircraft sale to Iran. If they find any violations, then I am confident they'll act immediately. In fact, less than 2 weeks ago, the director of OFAC appeared in front of our committee and affirmed, in response to a question from the author of this very bill, that, quote, if we see sanctionable activity, if we see sanctionable conduct, we act against it. I take the fact that the licenses are still in place, that the International Atomic Energy Agency has certified that Iran is complying with the nuclear deal on 9 separate occasions, as strong evidence that Iran is complying with its obligations. But this bill forces Treasury to second-guess themselves every 6 months until opponents of the JCPOA have what they want, a violation of U.S. commitments under the JCPOA that results in a collapse of this agreement. By taking the unprecedented step of naming banks participating in a legal business transaction specifically authorized by the U.S. government, well, it frankly discourages banks from participating. This is not to say that we don't continue to have significant issues with Iran. Of course we do. Like you, I'm concerned about their non-nuclear ballistic missile capability. I'm concerned about their destabilizing behavior across the Middle East. And yes, it concerns me that the Obama administration labeled Iran as a, quote, jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern. And we should address these issues. That's why I was so proud to support bills like the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which we passed last summer, and which included significant new sanctions on Iran's non-nuclear activities. But we agreed to allow the export of aircraft to Iran in exchange for highly specific concessions made by Iran regarding its nuclear program. We should not move the goalpost after the fact on what has already been agreed to, as this bill would do, because reopening the nuclear issue makes it harder, not easier, to make progress on all those other fronts. Let's be clear. This is, in fact, about JCPOA and whether it should live or die, no matter how much the bill's sponsors try to bring in new issues or pass responsibility to the executive branch. And though first and foremost the JCPOA supports our security, allowing the sale of aircraft also lets our manufacturers compete for more than $35 billion in new businesses that could support America jobs. If we block them, we hand that market to foreign competitors who can restructure their production lines easily to circumvent U.S. regulation and lose the extra assurance we receive from having Americans provide the maintenance and support on those planes. This is key. Those sales will go elsewhere. They'll go to non-American companies. The after-sale maintenance of those aircraft will no longer be managed by American interests. We will be less safe if these sales do not go through. So I intend to stand up for our security and our manufacturing base by opposing this bill. I hope you'll do the same. Next, Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1638, Iranian Leadership Asset Transparency Act. This bill targets the leadership of Iran, and I think that's a worthy goal. I think it eventually envisions publicizing negative information about them, and that's probably a good tool. We've all been through campaigns. We know negative advertising works, but I oppose this bill, and I do so for two reasons. Number one, resources are finite. Tracking down all of the assets of all of these named Iranian leaders takes significant time, effort, and personnel. And where are they supposed to come from? All around this city are people agitating for deep cuts to non-defense discretionary accounts. If we're going to make cuts, we need to make tough choices. The personnel responsible for implementing this bill would be diverted from terrorist financing and money laundering. Now, propaganda against Iranian leadership could be valuable, but it can't be more valuable than stopping terrorist financing. We had a lengthy discussion in committee just this morning about using money laundering authorities to fight human trafficking. That seems more valuable to me than propaganda, no matter how valuable the propaganda. So until we solve these tight budget constraints, I think we need to make the hard choices to prioritize resources for stopping money laundering and terrorism financing. Leave this effort for a world where the sequester has been lifted. Secondly, shouldn't we apply this principle more broadly if we're going to do it? The idea here is that we should investigate and publicize it when a country's leadership has undisclosed assets, especially if they are overseas. We should investigate and publicize it when a country's leadership is using government resources to enrich itself. But why just apply that principle to Iran? I got to thinking about that quite a bit, and I got to wondering, and I consulted this excellent leather book that was issued to me when I arrived here 5 years ago, and I read where a wise man once wrote, "How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take that speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your eye, and then you will clearly see to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Well, I wonder when this Congress and this committee will turn its attention to the plank in our eye. Next, Mr. Chairman, H.R. 4015, Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act. Frankly, this bill is a solution in search of a problem. Our capital markets are based on shareholder democracy. All shareholders are empowered to vote on their representatives on the board and on key questions of corporate governance. Democracies work better when voters are informed. We all have an interest in informed voters. Under ERISA, large asset managers are required to cast informed votes. So we have companies that have sprung up to serve that need, to educate and advise voters. Proxy advisory firms have been a key part of U.S. capital markets for 40 years. This bill is clearly meant to stifle these proxy advisory firms and to give the management of publicly traded companies more power over them. The question is why? Would we ever accept this sort of law in the democratic elections that each of us stand for? 30 years ago, President Ronald Reagan got rid of the so-called fairness doctrine, saying that it wasn't government's role to require broadcasters to present both sides of an issue. I think he presented it as a fundamental issue of free speech in our democracy. And so I was surprised to see members who celebrate many of President Reagan's accomplishments bring back the fairness doctrine, so-called, in the realm of shareholder democracy. This bill requires proxy advisory firms to preview their positions to corporate management and provide a mechanism for corporate management to complain or rebut these positions. What would Ronald Reagan think? Democracy is the best system of government. Everybody in this room agrees with that. But it requires free speech and robust debate. We should be encouraging more proxy advice, not stifling the companies that have taken the lead in providing it. And finally, Mr. Chairman, H.R. 2396, Privacy Notification Technical Clarification Act. This bill purports to be a technical correction to the Privacy Notice Bill that was enacted into law last year. For the record, I supported last year's bill. In fact, I supported it strongly. And I would gladly support a technical fix. This ain't a technical fix. Last Congress, we changed Graham-Leach-Bliley to change the circumstances under which financial institutions have to send our annual privacy notices. We said companies don't have to send a notice if their policy didn't change and they don't share any information with unaffiliated third parties. Auto lenders were not covered by last year's bill because they have to share with dealers or manufacturers. There is substantial support, including from me, for a technical fix that would lift the annual notice requirement for auto lenders that don't change their policy and don't share information with unaffiliated third parties except dealers or manufacturers as necessary to complete the loan. This is not that bill. In various iterations, this bill has been consistent in creating a loophole in GLBA, annual privacy notice requirement, even for companies that are sharing or selling information with unaffiliated third parties. And I just have to ask, in the aftermath of the Equifax disaster, that's tone deaf, and it's a big mistake. We should not be instituting widespread elimination of annual privacy notices at the very time that people are suddenly interested in how to limit sharing of their information. We should not be getting rid of the incentive in last year's privacy notice bill that gave favorable treatment for companies that don't sell or share information. The most recent version of this bill includes a new alternative privacy notice mechanism, and it's an interesting idea. I think the Financial Services Committee should look into it and hold hearings on it and maybe do another markup. But I don't think, frankly, and with all due respect, that this committee is the appropriate venue to consider a new privacy mechanism for the first time. With that, sir, thank you very much for the privilege of being here today.
Mr. Hack, thank you very much. I appreciate both of you not only taking time to offer your expert advice, but also you taking time to be before the committee today. Chairman Cole.
I just quickly want to thank both of our witnesses for being here, two of our very best members, but I have no question on the legislation.
Great. Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do. Mr. Hack, that was quite a speech you made there. And certainly I'm happy that you pointed out for the record the absolute hypocrisy of demanding to know where the Iranian leaders got their money, since the Americans are unable to know that about our own. I'm sure that the majority of people in the country would really like to know. I'd like to look at a tax return and some other things and find out about our own. I'm much impressed by that, putting those two together, and I agree with you again on privacy. The Equifax thing apparently didn't teach us a thing, but let's remind ourselves of it and not let that happen again. And this, I think, would aid in doing that.
If I may, Madam Ranking Member.
Yes.
It would be important for me, since you alluded to that or referenced that point in my testimony, to make sure that the members of this committee understand that I assign and impugn no motives of hypocrisy on the part of the authors of the transparency bill. I think the policy itself is dripping with hypocrisy, but I would not assign that characterization to the sponsors of this bill whatsoever, and appreciate the opportunity to clarify that.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that.
Does the gentleman wish to
If I
add
may
to this
just address the
conversation? Gentleman's recognized.
May I address the ranking
Of
members
course.
on the Equifax issue?
Absolutely, yes.
Just to make sure everybody's clear about what the bill does, it does not change any of the requirements under GLBA that protect consumer security and privacy. All it does is it changes the requirement that financial institutions send annual privacy notices in written form when they're agreeing to put them online. So there's no analogy with Equifax whatsoever. This is not about cybersecurity or data security. It's about paperwork burden. And all we're saying is that if a financial institution, an auto finance company, for example, has a policy in place to actually strengthen privacy protection by posting online the privacy policies, and they don't change their policies, then they don't have to generate millions of dollars of additional costs that ends up hurting consumers by resending them every year a policy notices when their policies aren't changing. It's just simply a cost-cutting measure, and the bill also requires them to notify the customers in their statements, for example, how they can access the privacy policy online. And if the consumer wants to receive every year this fine print and the legalese, if they want to receive that in paper, they can request it under the legislation, and they'll send that customer the information.
It would seem to me, Mr. Barr, that would be part of the cost of doing business, that you point out what your privacy requirements are and that you can allay the fears
We
of
agree.
persons who do business with you, that you are concerned about their privacy.
Absolutely.
And it can't possibly be that expensive.
So absolutely, I agree that they should know what the privacy policies are. It should be available
Right.
all the time online. When the institution or the company doesn't change its policies, and they've already sent the customer a detailed description of the policy, why do they have to resend it every year?
Because they may get new customers.
Oh, well-
Or a lot of people die. I mean, I
bill
think
doesn't
printing
change
it
that.
once is not good enough.
This legislation does not change that when there is a new customer, they receive the privacy notification. Does not change that at all.
Just to repeat, if I may, because you were about to ask me, weren't you, Madam Ranking?
That's quite all right, go ahead.
That if the bill did, as my dear friend from Kentucky suggested, I would be a yes vote. This opens the door for the sharing with third-party unaffiliated. If it were limited as a technical fix to auto,
That you only need to state once.
right, but it is not. And
Yeah.
the nexus to Equifax is very real. Congressman Barr is absolutely correct. This has nothing to do with cybersecurity, but it has absolutely everything to do with whether or not we are unlocking, if not opening the door, to the more broadly shared use of information that is gathered. Everything to do with it, and that is our point.
And I would just add that annual privacy notice requirements is not the same thing as security. Security of personal private information is critically important. We all agree with that. This is a matter of notification requirements and and I would add an effective notification, because what happens is when consumers are inundated with redundant privacy notices with fine print, nobody reads it. They throw it in the trash can. If consumers know that they're getting a privacy notice when a privacy policy changes, they're more likely to pay attention to it if they care. But simply overloading the consumer with fine print legalese every year means that consumers are going to have less meaningful notice of the actual privacy policies.
Well, let me just say, if it were my company, I would rather overload them with privacy notices every year than miss a chance to have somebody to know that. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. Thank you very much. The distinguished gentleman from Georgia. No questions. Gentleman does not seek time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
So I think I spoke enough, Mr. Chairman, so I will not say anything else unless somebody over there sets me off. So I will yield back my time.
Okay. The gentleman, Mr. Buck. Oh, no, excuse me. The gentleman, Mr. Buck.
For the purpose of setting my friend off, but no.
We're having fun here. This is a little bit of family fun. The gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Burgess, does not seek time. You're not going to put any condition on that. Judge, thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia. You know, this Christmas time has a lot to do with our success. You know, you're seeing a love fest today. I don't know how often you guys, Denny, you get to be a part of that. The gentleman from the state of Washington.
Just to add to the love fest, I just wanted to make an observation. First of all, we don't get very many speeches up here using the good book, so thank you, Mr.
I liked it.
Yeah. even though I disagree with the point he made. But I just wanted to, many times we get chastised for having bills up here and through this chamber that are one-sided, but just wanted to make an observation I believe is true. Mr. Barr, you could help clarify. Did not these bills pass out of committee with bipartisan support? Every single one of them, all four of them? In fact, one was a Democratic sponsor, if I'm not mistaken. So I just wanted to point that out, that these have gone through the process, and certainly there are different perspectives and opinions, but it is a bipartisan effort here. Isn't that true, Mr. Barr?
That is correct.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you, Mr. Heck, for your elevating the conversation.
You're more than welcome. If that didn't set you off, Mr. McGovern, I don't know what would get you. Yeah, okay.
You mean like saying it's gone through committee over and over again, and we're gonna try one more time to see if we can pass this off, or something like that?
The gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, do you seek time? The gentleman does not seek time. Denny, I want to be one of them to say I appreciate you bringing the good book. We used to call the Bible the good book when I grew up in our household. The second good book was a Boy Scout handbook. So we kept both of them around the house. But let me tell you, it is a good admonition for all of us to remember not only the words, but the emphasis behind it, that you better take care of your own before you start taking care of somebody else's. And I got that too. Gentlemen, I do not see where there's any other questions from the committee. I want to thank you for taking time to join us today. As always, please remember we had our awesome stenographer here who wants to finish out the record. So to the extent that you brought anything in writing, if you'll leave that with her, I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much. Is there any other member that would seek to give testimony to H.R. 1638, H.R. 4324, H.R. 2396, or H.R. 4015? Seeing none, the committee would now close the hearing portion, and the chairman would be in receipt of a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma who is getting ready to have a good December 30th. Is it January 1st?
January 1st.
January 1st, by the way. Congratulations on Heisman
Thank you.
Trophy winner,
Thank you
Baker
very much.
Mayfield. Gentlemen.
Good Austin, Texas young
Yes,
man.
sir. Offensive Player of the Year.
Mr. Chairman, we're very proud and congratulations to the Heisman winner, but January 1st will happen to be another issue of red and black, and I appreciate my gentleman, looking forward to the game. But standing up along with my colleague from Georgia, it's going to be a pretty good day for an Athens-based college, and I just have to say, go Dogs.
Well, it would not surprise me if one of you is here wearing the opposite person's T-shirt at the Rules Committee over your shirt. So just so we get into this, if y'all cut a deal with Tom, I'll promise to wear an Oklahoma shirt, a Georgia shirt, if you'll wear an Oklahoma shirt. Big 12 friendship. Okay, so if you set the trap, I'll be there for the Chiefs.
Well, I just, to my good friend from Georgia, we'll do a hostage exchange. I have a Georgia communications director who is a very loyal dog. And
There you go.
we're treating her with respect. We expect reciprocity for our fellow OU alum in your office.
If
Thank
it makes my friend, there is in my office, much to show you the openness and friendliness of our office, there is a Boomer Schooner in my office right now. It is disturbing, but it is there.
Well, I'll cut this short and get on with the motion,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman. We'll settle this on the field. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 2396, the Privacy Notification Technical Clarification Act. Rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. Rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Financial Services, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. Rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes an order only the further amendment printed in the Rules Committee report, if offered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. Rule waives all points of order against amendment printed in the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 4015, the Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act of 2017, under a closed rule. Rule provides 1 hour of debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-46 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You've now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion to that?
No.
The vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it.
Roll call, please.
Gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Buck? Aye. Mr. Buck? Aye. Ms. Cheney? Aye. Ms. Cheney? Aye. Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter? No. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye. No.
Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman?
I'm
Aye.
sorry, thank you. Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you very much. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, this would be, and this is what I was looking at, and I apologize, the gentleman, Mr. Woodall, that's the one I'm matching up. H.R. 2396 and H.R. 405 would be the gentleman, Mr. Woodall. Thank you very much.
And
Chairman,
Mr. Polis for the minority.
Mr. Post for the minority. The chair will now be in receipt of a motion for what would be the rule for H.R. 1638 and 4324.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 1638, the Iranian Leadership Asset Transparency Act. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. Rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as the original text for the purpose of amendment, an amendment in the nature of substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-47 and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of substitute. The rule makes an order only those further amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by the member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 4324, the Strengthening Oversight of Iran's Access to Finance Act. Under a structured rule, the rule provides 1 hour of debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-48 shall be considered as adopted, and the rule as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Rule makes an order only the further amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, if offered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in Part B of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Thank you very much. You now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion to that? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it.
And we need roll call,
The
please.
gentleman asked for roll call vote, clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Buck? Aye. Mr. Buck? Aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney? Aye. Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter? No. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Chairman? Aye. Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman, Mr. Buck from Windsor, Colorado, will be handling this for Republicans,
And Mr. Hastings from Florida.
and Judge Hastings will be handling this for Democrats. It appears as though we have now completed our work for the day. At this point, we have no additional scheduled hearings this week. So we are done with that, what appears to be for this week. I want to thank each of us for our collegial spirit today as we developed our work product, and I want to thank us very much. As the old saying goes, Merry Christmas.